Hello, and welcome to some Dodge family history. This is where I present information and research on my ancestors who served in the military during the early 20th century. Today, I will be presenting on draft registration cards from World War II. In preparing this presentation, I found that presenting some of the history of Selective Service registration and conscription helps provide context for the information that is available on the various draft registration cards. In addition to some of the history behind Selective Service registration, we will look at the different World War II draft registration cards, the information they contain, and how to read and understand the information contained on each draft card. With the threat of war looming in 1940, the United States implemented the first peacetime Selective Service registration, which took place on October 16th of 1940. All men between the ages of 21 and 35 were asked to register, with some 16 million registrants answering the call. This would be the first of 6 Selective Service registrations that would eventually take place between October of 1940 and December of 1942. The second Selective Service registration took place on July 1st, 1941, with all men who had turned 21 after the first Selective Service registration being required to register. The third Selective Service registration took place on February 16th, 1942, with all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register, with the exception of those who had previously registered. There would be a number of World War I veterans who would have registered in the third Selective Service registration. The fourth Selective Service registration, also known as the Old Man's Draft, was held on April 27, 1942. This fourth Selective Service registration was for all men between the ages of 45 and 65. The fourth Selective Service registration was used to measure the available manpower for wartime industries at home, as these men were too old to shoulder arms. This group of men would include many who had completed Selective Service registration, as well as those who had fought during World War I. The fifth Selective Service registration was held on June 30th, 1942, for all young men between the ages of 18 and 20. The sixth Selective Service registration was held in December of 1942, for all those who had reached the age of 18 after the fifth Selective Service registration. On December 1st, 1942, the Indianapolis Star indicated that those who were born on or after January 1st, 1925, shall be registered on the day they attain the 18th anniversary of their birth. And so Selective Service registration continued throughout World War II, with young men registering for the draft following their 18th birthday. Selective Service registration continued until the Selective Service Act was allowed to expire on March 31st, 1947. Each World War II draft card has 2 numbers at the top of each card, the serial number and the order number. The serial number was issued to each registrant following registration. With each Selective Service registration, each serial number was drawn and assigned to an order number. The order number determined when a registrant would be called up for examination to determine fitness for military service. The first draft lottery was held on October 29, 1940, and more than 8,000 serial numbers were drawn. With each succeeding draft registration, serial numbers and order numbers were assigned to each registrant. Also with each succeeding draft registration, additional lotteries were held. The second draft registration lottery was held on July 17, 1941, and the third draft lottery was held on March 17, 1942. With the fifth draft registration, the Garrett Clipper from Garrett, Indiana on July 9, 1942 explained, "Serial and order numbers for the new group will be assigned July 20th. These numbers will be determined by birth dates, with persons born in January 1st, 1922 having the number 1, and the persons born June 30th, 1924 having the last number. Registrants of the fifth group, composed of 18 and 19-year-olds, are not liable for military service until their 20th birth date." The system of calling up men for military service based upon their birth date continued through the remainder of World War II. In addition to draft registration, each registrant was sent a questionnaire that they had to fill out. While the draft cards and classification lists have been retained by the National Archives, the questionnaires were destroyed and no longer exist. The October 27, 1940 edition of the Birmingham News in Birmingham, Alabama, published a complete replica of the questionnaire. The questionnaire asked information about the registrant, including their identity, physical condition, education, occupation, dependents, religious beliefs, citizenship, court records, and previous military experience. These questionnaires would be used to help determine how to classify, from 1A to 4F, the millions of men who registered for the draft during World War II. Let's take a look at a couple of World War II draft cards. The first draft card we'll look at is for Don David DeMark. He was part of the first World War II draft registration on October 16, 1940. Don DeMark was born August 3, 1907 in Colorado Springs, was 33 years old, and lived at 527 East Platte. There was a note on the front side of his draft card dated October 6, 1942, giving his address as 2101 East Platte. He was married and listed his wife, Virginia Rose DeMark, as someone who would always know his address. Don was self-employed. According to the Colorado Springs directories, he was an auto electrician. The back of his draft card gives his height as 6 feet tall, weight as 168 pounds, brown eyes, black hair, and light brown complexion. The local draft board stamped the back of the draft card, indicating the local draft board number, county, and state where the registration took place. Looking at the front of the draft card again, his serial number is 853, and his order number was 1778. His order number indicates that he would have been the 1,778th registrant called up for examination to determine fitness for military service. I have located the classification list for Don DeMark, which is housed at the National Archives in St. Louis. The classification list indicates when he completed the draft questionnaire, as well as his draft classification. I was surprised to find that there were multiple classifications for him, indicating that the different classification categories were changing to meet the various circumstances of the individuals who registered for the draft. The questionnaire was mailed to him on April 21, 1941, and the questionnaire was returned to the local draft board 3 days later. Between 1941 and 1943, Don was classified as 1A, nominally available for military service, 1H, deferred, ages 28 and over, 2A, deferred in support of national health, safety, or interest, 3A, deferred for dependency reasons, and 3B, deferred both by reason of dependency and occupation essential to the war effort. Even with these different classifications, Don DeMark was ordered to report for induction on October 2, 1943. He reported. On October 13, 1943, he was ordered to report for transportation to the induction station. At the induction station, he was rejected for military service and reclassified as 4F. His final classification was 4A, indicating that he was at least 38 years old. The next World War II draft card we will look at is for Clarence Keith Newitt. He was part of the third draft registration in February of 1942. Keith Newitt lived at 43 Cotter Street in San Francisco. He was born on July 17, 1899 in Leadville, Colorado. He was 42 years of age, worked for Pacific Gas and Electric, and listed his wife, Mary Newitt, as someone who will always know his address. Keith Newitt was 6 feet tall, 194 pounds, had hazel eyes, brown hair, and a ruddy complexion. The date of his registration was February 14, 1942. At the bottom of the draft card is the local draft board stamp, indicating the local draft board number and address. Returning to the front of the card, his serial number was 40, and his order number was 10216. The San Francisco Examiner from March 15, 1942 reported that the ordered numbers for the new registrants will begin with 10,001. This means that the first serial number drawn will receive the order number 10,001. The questionnaire that would have been sent out following the draft lottery would have asked about previous military service. Keith enlisted in the U.S. Navy on April 14, 1917, and served until he was honorably discharged on July 26, 1920. He would have been one of many World War I veterans that would have registered for the third draft registration. However, because he had enlisted in the Navy before the World War I draft commenced, there is no World War I draft card for him. I have also located the classification list for Keith Newitt. The classification list indicates when he completed the draft questionnaire, as well as his draft classification. I was also surprised to find that there are multiple classifications for him, indicating that the different classification categories were changing to meet the various circumstances of the individuals who registered for the draft. The questionnaire was mailed to him on April 23, 1942, and then returned to the local draft board 5 days later. Between 1942 and 1943, Keith was classified as 1H, deferred, ages 28 or over, 2B, H, deferred in war production, ages 38 through 44. 3A, deferred for dependency reasons. 3B, deferred for both dependency and occupation essential to the war effort. And 4H, deferred, ages 38 through 44. He was ultimately classified as 4A, indicating that he was at least 38 years old. The last World War II draft card we will look at is from the Old Man's Draft, conducted in April of 1942. This is my great-grandpa, James Robert Dodge. He was one of many of the World War I veterans who would have been part of the Old Man's Draft. He also registered for the World War I draft in 1917 and was drafted in August of 1918. So there are two different draft cards for him. There is a serial number assigned to him, but there is no order number, as men in the fourth draft registration were not subject to military service. My great-grandpa was living at 633 West Davis Street in Rawlins, Wyoming. He was 48 years old and born on August 18, 1893 in Buena Vista, Colorado. In reality, he was actually 47 years old and born in 1894. He states that his wife, Alice Laura Dodge, will always know his address. He worked for Carbon County. He was 6 feet tall, 135 pounds, had gray eyes, brown hair, and a light complexion. The local draft board stamp is on the back of the card. There is no classification ledger for those who registered in the Old Man's Draft, as these men would not have been called upon to shoulder arms and fight. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and found it informative. The World War II draft represents a massive effort to record each male in the United States and how they would be best used to prosecute the war effort. As a result of selective service registration during World War II, more than 36 million men between the ages of 18 and 45 registered for the draft, with approximately 10 million of those being drafted into military service. In addition, more than 12 million men between the ages of 45 and 65 had registered for the Old Man's Draft. All available World War II draft cards from all the registration periods are available online at Ancestry, Family Search, and Fold3. However, no World War II draft cards from the state of Maine were retained and no longer exist. In addition, the Old Man's Draft cards from Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Maine, Mississippi, New Mexico, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee were destroyed before they could be microfilmed. The last presentation will look at draft cards from 1948 through 1975. Thank you.